During World War II, not only were people and ideas under attack, but culture. The Second World War saw unprecedented erasure of art and sculpture deemed inferior to the Nazis, and what they agreed with, they thieved. However, the Soviets suffered in particular in terms of human casualty and cultural destruction. During the Nazi pushback towards the end of the war, they then acquired art to be sent back to the home country as reparation for violence suffered at the hands of the Nazis. Thus, they should maintain ownership of the pieces they currently hold as sacred parts of their culture.
Everyone has learned of the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. However, it is difficult to communicate the scale of the damage and relative ease they had in coming to power. Adolf Hitler took advantage of Germany's economically and socially vulnerable state following the First World War and was able to rapidly ascend to power, first by taking control of the National Socialist Workers' Party, then by gaining seats in the German parliament, known as the Reichstag, before becoming appointed Chancellor of all of Germany. The Nazis came into force legally, legislating their way to total control. However, they weren't uncultured. Hitler had a deep respect for art. He applied to, and was rejected from, art school in Vienna twice. Unbeknownst to many, even now, the Nazis operated an extremely effective theft machine, stealing art and other valuables from Jewish people and others they subjugated. Through open plundering and institutionalized fear, the Nazis, during their conquests, acquired art from hundreds of artists, including one well-known Impressionist, Renoir.
Pierre-Auguste Renoir was born on February 25, 1841, in France. He grew up near the Louvre Museum in Paris, which had a profound impact on his artwork done in his adult life. He is associated mostly with the Impressionist movement and worked alongside fellow Impressionist Claude Monet in the late 1860s. As an artist, he predominantly focused on painting realistic, intimate snapshots from everyday Paris life. Renoir's work as an early Impressionist perfectly encapsulates what this new art form was about, through his use of short, multicolored strokes and putting focus on parts of the background that would have gone largely unnoticed by the average viewer. In the early 1880s, after traveling around a bit, he switched to a form that can be considered more classicism, which was a stark difference from his past works. Some of his most famous works are Luncheon of the Boating Party, Diana the Huntress, and Nude. Renoir developed arthritis in 1907 and died in France on December 3, 1919.
One of his most well-known works is In the Garden, an oil on canvas completed in France in 1855. In the Garden is frequently categorized as an Impressionist piece due to its liberal use of soft, broken brushstrokes and its emphasis on the placement of light. Throughout the piece, highlights are liberally dusted onto leaves, table, and clothing, bringing the eye around to all those details rather than having it settle on one aspect. This is assisted by blended nature of strokes, where one isn't certain where one stroke begins and another ends. The woman depicted is Aline Chargot, Renoir's girlfriend of the time, alongside fellow artist Henri Laurent, as a stand-in for himself. Thus, as a widely accepted member of the Impressionist school of thought, Renoir highlights the simplicity of lovers in a garden through gentle brushstrokes paired with gratuitous light.
The original owner of In the Garden was a man by the name of Otto Gerstenberg, an art collector and German businessman. Gerstenberg was notable in Berlin for leading the Victoria Insurance Company, the biggest insurance provider in Germany. As an avid art collector and a man with significant wealth, he was able to gather a collection of art from famous artists to build one of the most important art collections of his time. Included in this collection was In the Garden. Following the death of Gerstenberg in 1935, the ownership of his collection shifted to his daughter Margaret Scharf, who gave most of the large paintings that could not fit in her house to Victoria Insurance's main building. Most of these paintings burned in World War II bombings. As bombing intensified in Berlin, Scharf gave more paintings to the National Gallery in Germany for safekeeping, including In the Garden. In May 1945, Soviets took control of Berlin and took art collections from the National Gallery. Most of this trophy art, including In the Garden, is now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg.
How did the art make its way to the Hermitage? In response to massive losses, the Soviet Union decided to rebuild its collection with pieces left behind by the Nazis as they fled in defeat. More specifically, the Soviet Union suffered significant losses during its invasion by the Nazis, especially during the siege of Leningrad. currently known as St. Petersburg. In response to the utter destruction suffered, the Soviets designated a corps of military officers to identify and recover pieces of similar value. Thus, as the Nazis were pushed back in defeat, the Soviet zone of occupation was fair game for remunerations. The Soviets recovered pieces of similar value to the ones that were destroyed or lost at the beginning of the trophy brigades. Later in the war and after the Nazis' surrender, they collected greater amounts and values of work. However, the siege of Leningrad was not the Nazis' only crime.
Over the course of the two world wars, the German and Nazi armies committed thousands of war crimes, most notably the Holocaust. Additionally, the Nazis committed their own slew of crimes against civilians in the Soviet Union, such as raping and killing children and wiping out whole towns of people. This abuse the people suffered under the terror of the Nazis drove the desires of the Soviet army to defeat the Third Reich and were able to take over the capital city of Berlin. In this city, the Soviets took some notable works of art. Many people criticize these actions, claiming it is never appropriate to take culture from another country. On the contrary, many justify the theft, since the Soviet Union suffered under the Nazis, and the Nazis took advantage of other countries and looted them. All is fair during a time of war.
In all previous wars, to the victors went the spoils. During World War II, this precedent was unchanged. The victors did what they wanted with the cultural objects confiscated from the defeated peoples. The difference during World War II was the victors' choice of what to do with the spoils. The Allies chose to repatriate their objects of value, while the Soviets maintained ownership of theirs. This is not different from other cases involving repatriation, including other well-known cases, like the Elgin marbles. Not only are they critically important to their new homes, their removal would generate major cultural upheaval. Further, their current locations help build a thread of world culture. Artists of different nationalities, eras, and schools of work, in concert with each other, form a more complete picture of world history. Thus, the hidden treasures, as they are known collectively as an exhibit, support a narrative not possible in separate, discontinuous locations. The discovery of the hidden treasures was not accidental. It was a function of the Soviet state bureaucracy.
After the events of World War II, In the Garden was largely missing for the most part for 50 years, until it appeared in the Hidden Treasures Revealed exhibit in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. The exhibit, which boasts over 70 pieces of artwork, has been widely appreciated and criticized across the world for their displaying of many works of art taken in controversial ways. The display is a great show of culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and showing works like In the Garden helps viewers understand the cultural significance the art had on the period, and is also a great example of a typical Impressionist work of the time. However, these works are controversial in their current location in the Hermitage due to the questionable acquisition from the Nazis when the Soviets raided Berlin in an effort to limit Nazi control over Europe. On the contrary, some argue this removal is justified as retribution for the war crimes Nazis committed against the Soviet army, land, and citizens.
Owing to the sheer magnitude of violence directed towards the Soviets, they should retain ownership of the Hidden Treasures exhibit and other pieces, including In the Garden. More specifically, the population of the Soviet Union decreased by 13.7% during the war years, while the United States lost 0.32% and the United Kingdom lost 0.94%. Even France, totally conquered by the Nazis, lost 1.44%. Thus, the magnitude of the loss, although significant in all cases, was unprecedented when compared to other Allied nations involved in the European theater. Further, the precedent of repatriating critical cultural objects doesn't exist. The other main object of repatriation arguments, such as the Elgin marbles, has not and seems to not have any plans to be returned to Greece.
Finally, similarly to the Elgin marbles, their current location keeps them in concert with other pieces in a world cultural narrative available to people from all over the world. Maintaining the Hermitage Trove in the Hermitage, especially pieces such as Renoir's In the Garden, forms a cohesive depiction of major art schools and eras. Specifically, In the Garden is part of a grouping of other Impressionist masterpieces, providing the viewer with a unified snapshot of the genre. Thus, the current location In the Garden calls home is where it should stay, for matter of restitution, precedent, and narrative.
Therefore, the paintings should stay in Russia. While they were originally German cultural objects, the "to the victors go the spoils" narrative, sheer volume of casualties suffered on behalf of the Soviet Union, and the precedence and interaction between other pieces in the exhibition make the idea of repatriating the pieces to the descendants of the owners, who may have no connection other than it belonged to their ancestors, an exercise in futility. The cultural significance of In the Garden and other Impressionist masterpieces is their connectedness. It has been said a masterpiece does not transcend a moment, but keeps it alive. The Hermitage Trove holds a collection of moments that together idealize Impressionism.